Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Loka Shankaram Puranan Nyaya Mimamsa Dharma Shastranga Mishritaha Vedaha Sthanani Vidyanam Dharmasya Cha Chaturdasha Ayurvedo Dhanurvedo Gandharvaschaiva Te Trayaha Arthashastram Chaturthantu Vidyaha Ashtadashaivataha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaste. I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to making this conference possible. In the interest of time, I'll skip many things and just get to the point. I would have preferred to control this presentation myself, but we are doing it in a split mode. So don't worry if you're not able to read what's on the slide or if it's lagging behind. But if you can stay with what I'm speaking, then that might help. Okay? So the abstract of my paper reads, is the term Shiva as a noun attested only in the Itihasas and Puranas, and therefore in existence supposedly only after 500 BCE? Was Shiva a minor, non-supreme figure in the text corpus indigenous to the Indian subcontinent before Shweta Upanishad? Does clear and reliable evidence for organized sectarian worship of Shiva exist only after the beginning of the Common Era? These are the three questions that animate this paper. If you were to look for answers to these questions in the entry for Shaivism in the Oxford bibliographies, which sports a tagline, "Your best research starts here," or Wikipedia for that matter, you will find either answers or sources to answers in the near affirmative, which means yes to all the questions that you see over here. This paper will foreground evidence that problematizes answers in the affirmative to the above mentioned questions. It will do so in part by foregrounding evidence about Shiva from Ashtadasha Vidya texts that appear missing in at least those essays considered up-to-date introductions on the historical developments of the Shaiva sectarian traditions by Peter Bishop, the author of the entry for Shaivism in the Oxford bibliographies. So I'm basically looking at what is written, which are the key essays on Shaivism in Oxford bibliographies and Wikipedia, and I've identified three issues which I'll be touching upon, which I believe are fairly critical to the overall narrative of Shaivism. So what you see on top, could you move on to the next slide? Yeah. What you see on top, just keep clicking until I tell you. This is why I would have preferred to do it myself, but keep clicking, click, click again, click again, click again, end. One more click. Okay, so that's the structure of the presentation. So there's a brief focus on the body of work. Part 1 will relate to the antiquity of the usage of Shiva as a noun. Keep this in your mind. Part 1 is usage of Shiva as a noun. Part 2 is Rudra Shiva as supreme before Shweta Upanishad. And part 3 is evidence of organized sectarian worship of Shiva before the Common Era, followed by conclusions. Click. I'll move on over here. I'm not focusing. Please move on. Click, click again, click again. Okay, click part 1. So the excerpt that I'd be tackling is this. Quote, "The term evolved from the Vedic Rudra Shiva to the noun Shiva." The term evolved from the Vedic Rudra Shiva to the noun Shiva in the epics and the Puranas as an auspicious deity who is the creator, reproducer, and dissolver. This is a sentence that you will find in Wikipedia if you go now and click. Now, I think this is problematic, and I'll explain why. Epics and the Puranas is mentioned in excerpt 1 as the source of the usage of Shiva as a noun. The source link of excerpt 1 does not allude to the chronological epoch of the epics and the Puranas. That is, in this Wikipedia article, they have not given a chronological epoch for Puranas and the epics. Yet I have added 500 BCE in question 1 of the abstract, which you saw, in part because of the epochs assigned to Ramayana, 500 BCE to 300 CE, and the Mahabharata, 400 BCE to 400 CE, and the Puranas, roughly 100 BCE to about 600 CE, in figure 1.1 of Upinder Singh's book, A History of Ancient and Early Medieval India. Why this book? Because this is the common reference textbook in undergraduate courses in universities in India, right? I have written on chronology on other aspects, so I don't want to get into whether it is correct to date Mahabharata between 400 BC, 400 CE, etc. I have other work, but that is not the focus of this particular conference, this particular paper in this conference. I'm going to situate myself in the mainstream chronology and still present the arguments so that we are not, on cross purposes when it comes to chronology. So this is the chart. Please click. So this is the chart that you will find in Upinder Singh's book. So the Vedic texts roughly finish at about 500 BC, as you can see. The Vedanga texts finish roughly, according to her, by about 200 BCE. Then you have the Mahabharata, as I mentioned, in the Ramayana, and the other texts, right? This is just for a visual map. Keep this in the back of your mind. Next slide, please. Now, according to the image that we just saw, Vedic text, as you saw, was assigned an epoch that ended in 500 BCE. Later in the same book, Singh has written, and I quote, historians divide the Vedic corpus into two parts, early and later Vedic texts, although recent studies indicate a more complex internal chronology. Early Vedic literature refers to the family books of the Rig Veda Samhita. Later Vedic literature includes book 1, 8, 9, and 10 of the Rig Veda Samhita, the Samhitas of the Sama, Yajur, and Atharva Vedas, and the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads attached to all the 4 Vedas. The cultural stages reflected in the two broad strata of early and later Vedic texts have come to be known as the early and later Vedic cultures. The principal Shrauta Sutras and some of the early Gruhya Sutras have been dated circa 800 to 400 BC, unquote. I don't fully agree with this, but for the moment, for the purpose of this paper, I'm going to situate myself in this frame and still try to respond to that statement, right? Given all of the above, it follows that if one finds evidence for the usage of Shiva as a noun in a Vedic Samhita or an early Gruhya Sutra, we just saw when that belongs to, then the assertion in excerpt 1 is partly, at least partly, if not wholly, invalidated. What was the assertion in excerpt 1? It related to the antiquity of usage of Shiva as a noun and when it started, right? So you see the term, the excerpt is again back over on top. So now consider the following evidence. In a paper published in 1960 by Sukumari Bhattacharjee, has alluded to the usage of Shiva as a name in Shukla Yajur Veda 1651, which begins with the following. Meedhishtuma Shivatama Shivonaha Sumana Bhava. Okay? This is a scholar who has written in 1960 already. So it's not new evidence that I am presenting, but as part of my literature survey, when I read her book, there is clear evidence she is pointing to where Shiva has been used as a noun. And why that is important, we will come to in a bit, right? So the point over here is that this is one piece of evidence. In R.L. Kashyap's work, after his translation of the Vajasenayi Samhita, 1641, which is very familiar to most of us, I guess, over here, Namah Shambhavaya cha Mayo Bhavaya cha, Namah Shankaraya cha Mayaskaraya cha, Namah Shivaya cha Shivataraya cha. R.L. Kashyap has made it a point to remark thus, and quote, here is the famous 5-lettered mantra to Shiva, Namah Shivaya, right? Very clear, no ambiguity. Yet you see this in Wikipedia in 2022, and you should realize why that is problematic. Moving on now from the pre-500 BCE Veda Samhita, I think you will need to click a few times to come to the slide that I am on. That is why I would have preferred to do this myself, but please click. Yeah. Please click further. Go back. Sorry, go back. I apologize for this, I guess, but I would have preferred to do this myself. Moving on now from the pre-500 BCE Veda Samhita, seen above, that is the Vajasena Samhita, to evidence used for the usage of Shiva as a name in an early Grihya Sutra. Right? You remember the chart? You remember Grihya Sutra from that? The Ashvalayana Grihya Sutra. In the Ashvalayana Grihya Sutra, 4.8.19, and I'm not reading out the text fully now, you have Haraya, Mridaya, Sarvaya, Shivaya. Right? And that usage is also very clearly, unambiguously in the noun form. Now, I'm moving on to part 2, which is Rudra Shiva as supreme before Shvetashvetara Upanishad. A lot of people are okay with, I mean, it is kind of common, you'll find in, especially in the essays by Gavin Flood that you see on your screen right now, and Lorenzen. Let me actually put out the excerpt so that it's clear for you. Next, please click. And move that Zoom window from there, please. Yeah. So, essays Peter Bishop, who is the author of the entry for Shaivism in Oxford Bibliographies, refers to as up-to-date introductions of the historical development of Shaiva sectarian traditions. These are the essays. Shaivism an Overview, authored by Lorenzen et al., which is 1987, in the Encyclopedia of Religion, and the Shaiva Traditions by Gavin Flood, 2003, in the Blackwell Companion to Hinduism. So if you go to any academic mainstream discussion on Shaivism, and in the West particularly, and if you haven't read these, then we would be considered we have not actually read up to actually come and have a conversation. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm just saying that's how central these are to those conversations. So now, next slide, please. And you'll have to again move that zoom to somewhere, maybe on the Oxford Bibliographies. Excerpt 2. And this is a textual philological paper, so you will have to kind of stay with me, right? It's not images of temples and stuff like that. So excerpt 2 is, quote, but it is only with Shvetashvetara Upanishad that a theism, it is only with the Shvetashvetara Upanishad that a theism focused upon Rudra Shiva begins to emerge in the literature. Hence, Rudra is elevated from a feral deity on the edges of the society, right? Watch the words. Feral deity on the edges of society to the status of the supreme being. So, Shvetashvetara Upanishad marks this turning point for some reason. Before that, he was feral and he was on the edges, apparently, and then there is this transition which has happened. Excerpt 3, quote, the god Rudra Shiva appears for the first time as an object of monotheistic devotion rather suddenly in the Shvetashvetara Upanishad, a text often described as a Shaiva Bhagavad Gita, which is correct. The Shvetashvetara is one of the later of the early Upanishads, possibly dating from about 6th century BCE. Now, again, I might not fully agree with the dating, but for the purposes of this paper, I'm situating myself within this frame. And I want to listen to Lorenzen when he says it's 6th century BC and talk to him on that frame itself. Okay? So, now I'll cite Sri Aurobindo first in response to these two excerpts that we just saw before giving new evidence from my own end. Quote, it was a view long popularized by European scholars that the greatness of Vishnu and Shiva in the Puranic theogonies was a later development, and that in the Veda, these gods had quite a minor position and are inferior to Indra and Agni. The importance of Vedic gods has not to be measured, according to Sri Aurobindo. The importance of Vedic gods has not to be measured by the number of hymns devoted to them or by the extent to which they are invoked in the thoughts of the rishis, but by the functions that they perform. It is not the number of hymns, it is not the extent of invocation, but it is the actual function which will require engagement and understanding. Agni and Indra, to whom the majority of the Vedic hymns are addressed, are not greater than Vishnu and Rudra, but the functions which they fulfill in the internal and external world were most active, dominant, and directly effective for the psychological discipline of the ancient mystics. This alone is the reason of their predominance. Sri Aurobindo's words. The Maruts, children of Rudra, are not divinities superior to the fierce and mighty father, but they have many hymns addressed to them and are far more constantly mentioned in connection with other gods. On the other hand, Vishnu, Rudra, Brahmanaspati provide the conditions of Vedic work and assist it from behind, the more present and active gods, but are less close to it and in appearance, less continually concerned in its daily movements. So Sri Aurobindo is very clearly responding to some of the views of his time, saying that this quantitative method, if applied selectively, might not be a good way to go about it, right? But we still see that continuing. Now, quote, Bhandarkar in 1913, by his power, by Bhandarkar I mean R.G. Bhandarkar, by his power he perceives all earthly beings. Please move on to the next slide if you have. Yes, you're on the right slide. Thank you. By his power he perceives all earthly beings, and by his universal sovereignty he perceives divine beings. Rigveda 7:46-2. Here, even in the Rigveda, Rudra is raised to supreme power. So Rigveda is obviously before Shvetashvetara Upanishad by their framework itself, right? So this is Bhandarkar in 1913 presenting why he thinks Rudra was supreme even before the Shvetashvetara Upanishad. Now I'll quote Chakravarti. He now becomes the lord of all quarters, of forests and fields, of trees and plants, of food and moving creatures. Herein lies the reason which rendered him in later times the omnipresent supreme lord of the universe. Right? Very clear positions. Now these are secondary sources for which they have given primary references. In addition to this, so the references are over here, cited by Chakravarti and by Bhandarkar. For the lack of time, I'm not actually going to go through it, but it's there in my slides and papers, so you'll be able to pick it up and read it. I posit, thanks to a pointer from, again, R.L. Kashyap ji's book, that Trayambakam Yajamahe itself conveys that notion of supreme in no unambiguous ways. So I don't see why so much should be made about this turning point of Shvetashvetara Upanishad. Why all of this is important is because it creates cleaves which actually don't seem to exist and then gives rise to spurious other theories or allows these to be used to lend support to other spurious theories, right? Therefore, we should be conscious of where these are, at least I think so. Moving on to part 3, which is evidence of organized sectarian worship of Shiva before the Common Era. Excerpt 4, quote, the roots of early Shaivism can be traced back to the worship of the Vedic deity Rudra, but it is only in the centuries after the start of the Common Era, note that, it is only in the centuries after the start of the Common Era that there is clear and reliable evidence for the existence of organized sectarian worship of Rudra Shiva with the appearance of Pashupatas or followers of Pashupati, unquote. This is according to Bishop in that Oxford bibliographies, which you can access now on your phone. Here's evidence that I think vitiates this. Excerpt 4 in the preliminaries of this paper, which is from the Oxford bibliographies entry for Shaivism, asserts that, whatever I read right now, this assertion is in my view untenable or at least problematic in light of 2.4.17 of the Arthashastra. When is Arthashastra dated? When is Arthashastra dated? BC? BC at least, 3rd century BC, right? So, I'm going to read 2.4.17 from Arthashastra. Aparajita pratihata jayanta vaijayanta koshtan Shiva Vaishravanaya. Okay, and I'm not reading the rest of it. I will read translation so that people will be able to understand. I just want to mention Shiva. Kangle's translation. He should cause to be built in the center of the city. Center of the city. Shrines for Aparajita, Aparatihata, Jayanta, Vaijayanta, as well as temples for Shiva. Clear, Arthashastra. In the center of the city. Oliville's translation is also something similar. In the middle of the city, he should have these built, shrines for Aparajita and abodes of Shiva. How can the Arthashastra in BCE be talking about building a mandir, kovil, temple in the center of the city if the existence of organized sectarian worship of Shiva was after the Common Era? Right? So, in my reading of Shaivism, and I'm no scholar of Shaivism, not at all, I'm more a concerned commoner engaging with these introductions to Shaivism that we read in academic sources. I find it problematic that such narratives are pushed. Now, even if the recently published revisionist views of Mark McLeish on the history of the chronology of the Arthashastra, there's a new work on the chronology of Arthashastra itself, which is pushing the Arthashastra further down, right, than what you just said right now. And that is perhaps the cutting edge when it comes to Western academia on the chronology of Arthashastra. Even by that framework, by that framework, the sources of, I can't expound on McLeish's entire argument. I'm writing another paper. I've critiqued a part of it already in one of my other papers. But even by that framework, it is still in BCE. So if somebody is using even McLeish's arguments, these verse 2:4:17 in McLeish's framework is still in BCE. So nobody can cite McLeish to me to say that you can't use Arthashastra to respond to them. That's the point that I'm trying to make over here. So in conclusion, unless engaged with and shown to be untenable, and until that happens, this paper, by critically engaging, insofar as I could see, for the first time, with 3 sweeping conclusions about the early history of Shaivism, as found attested in contemporary academic literature concerned with Shaivism, puts forth a unique contribution. In 2.1, based on textual evidence from Vajasenayi Samhita and the Ashvalayana Grihya Sutra, I posit that there is evidence for the usage of Shiva as a noun from before 500 BCE. In 2.2, I have foregrounded an explanation by Sri Aurobindo and textual evidence presented by Ramakrishna Gopal Bhandarkar and Mahadev Chakravarti from the Rigveda and Vajasenayi Samhita respectively, which problematized the view that Rudra Shiva became supreme only in and after the Shveta Upanishad. In 2.3, I have invoked unambiguous evidence from the Arthashastra to present what seems like a rarely made case, if at all made before, in the literature dealing with Shaivism, of worship of Shiva in temples/abodes before the Common Era. Thank you.